to Safe Inside, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy Loomis, and these are my conversations with Sandra Fields, an LPC and certified clinical trauma treatment provider with over 35 years' experience helping people who have been through trauma. Welcome back to the Safe Inside podcast, brought to you by TheraTribe. I'm Jeremy.
And I'm Sandy.
And this time we're talking today about how to name it to tame it.
Yeah, I love these little sayings that we have in trauma treatment.
They're useful. They're helpful.
They're very helpful.
They're also rather catchy.
They are. And actually the credit for this particular one goes to Dr. Dan Siegel.
Okay.
Who does a lot of trauma work, of course. And so just some credit to him before we go down that. But he's the one who actually coined that phrase.
Okay.
And it's funny because as therapists, we use that phrase a lot and we don't actually go, oh, that was from Dr. Siegel, but it was. Even kids I've worked with are able to remember this phrase. And when you're in trauma work, especially when you're working around affect regulation, it's really important to have these things that people can hold on to and remember. We have a lot of tools as therapists, and I'm noticing that I see more and more on social media and in public realm around, if you are dissociating or if you're dysregulated, you can do these things, and that is fabulous and wonderful. However, when people, especially when they start trauma treatment and they're in the midst of a trauma response, it's hard to remember all of those things. So the fact that Dr. Siegel was able to coin such a catchy phrase, name it to tame it, that makes it easier for us to do our jobs, which means it makes it easier for clients to regulate using this particular technique. So that was part of why I wanted to attribute to him, because it sounds so simple, but it's such a powerful concept, this name it to tame it. So what it is basically whenever we get overwhelmed emotionally. And in trauma work, that happens quite a bit for someone who's experienced complex trauma in their lives. There are a lot of reminders in life of that trauma. And whenever that happens, we drop down into what's known as our limbic brain. And this is the parts of our brain, what we used to call like the lizard or the reptile brain and the mammalian brain, but it really is kind of the brain stem all the way up, so that lower brain all the way up to the midbrain through to the hippocampus. The hippocampus works as a filter. Everything that we see or hear or do or feel goes to our hippocampus, and our hippocampus goes, is this dangerous or is this not dangerous? If it's not dangerous, it allows it to pass on to our executive functioning part of our brain. If our hippocampus thinks that it's dangerous, it disconnects the communication between the hippocampus and all of the brain below that and the executive functioning, or our cortex. And I tell the kids all the wrinkly parts of your brain, but all of the executive functioning parts of our brain, especially that left brain piece, it disconnects. And so whenever we feel like we're overwhelmed with emotion, then our executive functioning disconnects this communication with our lower brain, and we start acting out of our lower brain, but we are not always aware of that. So for instance, I'm in a meeting, I'm in a leadership meeting with all the other executives, and I have maybe a couple of the men in there, and they start bullying me, or they say some statements that are really feel very aggressive, and I get overwhelmed with emotions. It might trigger my trauma from the past, or it might just be that situation in and of itself. My hippocampus goes, oh, okay, this is not a good situation, so I'm going to disconnect my communication to the executive functioning. And so at that point in time, I have an option, and the option usually is I can run away, I can fly, or I can fight, and I can open my mouth and say something that I might regret later. Many of us have been in situations where we look back and we think, I'm embarrassed about what I said or how I acted and all of that. And it's like, I can't believe I did that. I know better than to do that. And it's because we're acting out of that lower part of our brain, that lower and midbrain. So name it to tame it is a way to help sort of work through those emotions in that moment. When that happens, if we can put a word to what we're feeling in our brain, it will have to pull that executive functioning back online, that left brain back online. So if in that meeting, all that happens and I feel myself flood with emotion, but if I remember to name it to tame it, I can think, I am feeling angry and disrespected. I'm putting words to that, which means I have to use my left brain, my executive functioning. And so it pulls that logical piece back down. At the same time, it doesn't allow for that overwhelm of that limbic system. It kind of shortens that moment. So I'm naming it. And just the act of naming it, because of the biological basis that I have to use in order to name that feeling, means then that my feelings no longer overwhelm me. I move into that logical space. And in that moment, I then have an option. If I'm angry and I'm feeling, because I feel disrespected, then I have an option to speak clearly and assertively, in a way that later on I'll go, yeah, that was the right thing to do. And so that's kind of the concept around the name it to tame it.
Is there an aspect to this of you're taking something that is completely uncertain, we don't know what level of threat this is, and once you name it, it becomes, it at least to some degree comes out of that level of uncertainty?
Absolutely. If you think about just about anything, if we think of a concept that's in the abstract, it almost always feels overwhelming until we can start pulling apart the pieces and identifying the pieces. A task is that way. If I tell a child to go clean your room, it feels overwhelming and they have a hard time starting to do it. If I tell a child, go in there and pick up all the trucks on the floor, they at least have one task that they can focus on. So it's it's pulling out the pieces and identifying that. So it feels less ambiguous and it feels more manageable. So if I know I feel angry and I can say that, at least to myself, then that means I know what's going on inside of me anyway, and I can separate that from what's going on outside of me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that sounds pretty practical.
It's very practical, and it sounds very simple, but it actually takes some practice to do.
The dangerous thing with things that sound simple is sometimes they seem like they're not worth doing because they seem so simple.
Right. And this is one of those things that it does seem extremely simple, and yet it is extremely powerful. And through trauma treatment, it is necessary to be able to do this. Now, this does assume that the client or whoever's using the name it to tame it can identify their own feelings, and that's not a given with people who've experienced complex trauma. That would be work that a therapist would do with them before they get to this point. But once they can identify feelings, then they start in the moment trying to figure out, how do I feel? And then saying, I am feeling this. That statement's very powerful. And it also owns their feelings. Part of being a trauma survivor means that your agency of your body and yourself and who you are and everything has been violated, and someone has said that they own it in whatever way. And so being able to take my feelings and say, I am feeling, I'm owning that feeling, and that also gives me a sense of agency. That is, of everything in trauma treatment, the more agency that we can help a client step into, the faster they will heal, because that is such a fundamental part of the foundation of trauma treatment. So being able to actually own your feelings and just naming, yes, I am feeling, and saying, it's kind of like, yes, this is my home, or yes, this is my dog, or yes, this is my life, saying, yes, this is my anger, yes, this is my fear, yes, this is my overwhelm, yes, this is my whatever it is that you're feeling. Being able to own that is a piece of that really helps move you forward into a space where you can take more agency.
So at this point, for just very simple review, we've identified an external aspect and an internal aspect of this. We identified naming the threat sometimes, and identifying naming how it's affecting you, naming your own feelings, which, yeah, that can be a process to even get to that point, but at least beginning to exercise both of those things. Are those the basic dimensions of this, or are there more?
No, those are the basic dimensions. It's, again, it's a very simple concept, but it's one of those things that, even though it's simple, and I wonder if the simplicity actually adds to it, but it is very powerful. So, I can sit here and say that, and people are going, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I got it. It's simple. But it's the practicality of actually doing it in the moment that makes a huge difference. So sometimes it's hard to separate ourselves from that overwhelm, separate ourselves from all that amorphous feelings that we have, and be able to name them, especially if we're not used to doing that. So there is a technique that I teach my clients. It's not a new technique, I didn't make it up, but it is a type of mindfulness technique. It's actually a kid's technique, but it works really well with adults too. And it's called Be the Pond. And so what I teach my clients is that they are a pond. They are this body of water. They're not an ocean that is busy and big waves and all the currents. They're not a lake for the same reason. They are a pond. They are just a still body of water that exists. It's just not too hot, not too cold. It just is this body of water. And when feelings come in, they are like fish coming in the stream into the pond, coming through the pond and going out on the other side through the stream. They're still going upstream or downstream, or whichever way. I guess salmon's the only thing that goes upstream, but whatever. They're going through the pond. Now, as they come through the pond, we would feel the ripples. If we were the water, we would feel the ripples come through, but the pond is not the fish. The pond is the pond. It's the water. The fish are the fish. They're separate. Again, the pond feels the fish, but the pond is not the fish. And so if you see yourself as the pond and our feelings as fish, then it becomes this mindful observer activity where I can say to myself, I am the pond, be the pond, and I see this fish. There is an angry fish. That's a big angry fish. It's leaving a lot of ripples, but it is an angry fish. I am not the fish. I am the pond. Eventually, if I see it that way, I know that anger will go on out the other side. So I don't even have to do anything with that anger at the moment. It's just going to come through. I'm going to observe that it's there. I'm going to name it. And then I'm going to go, hello, angry fish. I see you there. And then it's going to eventually swim out on the other side. There might be a little yellow fish. That's a little happy fish. And it comes through. And I feel those ripples. I'm still not that fish. I am the pond, right? And so it can be a whole school of different fishies, right? With different feelings. It could be an angry and irritated and sad and confused and all of that. We can name all of those, and that school of fish will still go on through because I am not the fish. So it's all about I am not my feelings.
You are a container that is able to hold them all.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right, which is another analogy that we use a lot in
And yet
counseling.
it's not all that different of an analogy, because a pond really is a container for fish.
It is. It absolutely is. And so, the ripples from the fish make sense because we do feel the ripples from our anger or our happiness or whatever it is, but they're just literally ripples from fish that aren't us. So that's a good way of being able to name it and tame it, and at the same time staying that mindful observer, recognizing that that's a fish. There is a YouTube, it's a short kids YouTube animation video called Be the Pond by Zen Kids, but it's good for adults too. It's just a way of being able to be that, like I said, that mindful observer. You'll read a lot of adult books around this name it to tame it, and it will say, be that mindful observer, and everyone's looking at me like, okay, so how do I do that? Because I'm like, I don't know, be the pond. They're like, I got that. So it's just a good visualization of remembering that when we name it, it tames it. At the same time, it separates us from our feelings, not as if they're not our feelings. We're owning them. They're our fish. However, we are not that fish. Feelings
Yeah.
are important, but we are not feelings.
It seems like isolation is one of the big complicating factors of this, because if all you have to keep you company is your depression, for instance, then that can become easy to not just feel it, but identify with it, identify as it.
Absolutely. That's so true. And we say that a lot when I am sad. I am angry.
I am sadness.
I am sadness. Oh my goodness. I am anger. I am no, you are not those things. You are feeling those things. And that's the difference. That's why it's important to, when you name it, I am feeling.
This didn't really hit me in this way until right now, so I'm going to say it while I still see it in my mind. I don't know if you've ever seen some of the art that people will make with resin. They'll make fish, and then they'll add layers, and so it looks like fish in a bowl, even though the whole work took a bunch of layers with transparent resin and stuff like that. So we've talked in previous episodes. If you've been with us since the beginning, you've already heard some of this about trauma keeping you stuck in a moment that you can't get out of. And it seems what we're describing, because of being stuck in a moment, it's like a pond with living fish becomes a static image of this fish bowl that has this freeze frame, flash frozen fish that becomes a static entity and stops being a movement. And to live in real time, you can see those fish and the way you experience those fish, you can experience that as a movement. But once you become stuck and it just becomes one moment that you're fixed in, fixed is a terrible word because of the unintended double entendre there. But if you are stuck in that, I would say you necessarily experience it differently.
You do.
You turn a verb into a noun.
Exactly. And that is part of an important part of trauma treatment is to take that analogy a little further. It'd be almost like sort of melting that flash frozen and allowing those fish, naming it and taming it. Look at my trauma. Yes, I see that I am very angry at my dad. Oh, yes, I see that I have a lot of shame here. I'm feeling a lot of sadness around this. I'm feeling a lot of fear around this. Whatever it is, being able to name those feelings around that trauma, even if your trauma was 30 years ago, it's flash frozen. We stay stuck in time around that until we do this. And so it's a way of recognizing our feelings. Deepak Chopra says that our feelings have feelings.
I love that. I've bookmarked that one section of the shadow effect.
Yeah, and our feelings do have feelings. If we deny them long enough, they become very barbarous and very overwhelming. And so, recognizing that we do have these feelings, we are feeling these feelings around our traumas, and as long as we pretend we're not allowing those fish to swim on through. We're damming that up or flash freezing it or whatever, but those fish are stuck there.
It's actually a more effective double meaning there.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
So that naming it to tame it means that we would look at our trauma, we go through during our trauma narrative and other times in trauma treatment, and we say, I am feeling really angry that my mother didn't protect me, which sometimes doesn't feel like a very safe thing to say, or sometimes people feel very ashamed that they feel these things. It may be if there's some trauma bonding going on, which is a type of abuse that causes people to have strong feelings towards their abuser. And it's a particular psychological phenomenon, sort of, that we used to call Stockholm Syndrome. I'm throwing that out there on the side. But if you have gone through trauma bonding and you're coming out on the other side and you're working through your trauma treatment and you're realizing how badly this person treated you, and sometimes how you went back to this person time and time again, and that shame comes up and it's like, why did I do that, right? And so you might say, I'm feeling shame and embarrassment around that, and then we're able to work through that. By the way, if that's happened to you, there's no need to be ashamed and embarrassed. We can talk through it, but it is an actual, it's almost like a setup, a form of manipulation that causes that trauma bonding. So, but there can be those kinds of things. It can be, well, I thought I was in love with my abuser, or things like that, that can sometimes be difficult to voice to your own self. And so it's important to be able to name these things and allow those fish to just go on through the pond, remembering that you aren't those fish. It's just a good way of reminding us that these feelings, even though they try to overtake us, that we're just feeling the ripples. We really aren't the fish. And I think it's a good thing to remember. Again, feelings are important, and I don't want to invalidate anyone's feelings. I'm a counselor after all. But they're only important in that they are sort of signposts, or they give us data or information about something that's going on within or without something around our experience to which we need to pay attention. So that's the importance of feelings.
They sort of tell you how to dress for the weather.
They sort of do. And so name it to tame it is a really easy way, easy conceptually, to separate in enough way to be able to pull that executive functioning back down, to then give you that agency to decide, first of all, what you want to do in the moment, and maybe what you want to do with whatever it was that you believe moved you into that feeling. And so if it's a current situation, like the one I started out with, if I could pull my executive functioning back online, then I would be able to then decide, how do I want to respond to these men, if at all, in this meeting, outside the meeting. What do I want to say, or what do I not want to say? How do I want to handle this in a way that would be more logical and probably more productive? If it were around my trauma and I had a trauma trigger, and my trauma got bumped, is what I call it, and I have a trauma trigger, and I have this response, and I have these overwhelming emotions, and I could think, well, I'm feeling fear and anger and sadness, and I have all of these emotions. I can decide what I want to do with them right now. I can decide if I want to do some body work to help regulate my system. Maybe I need to do that. Maybe I need to do some vagus nerve work. Maybe I need to go for a walk. Maybe I need to write in my journal. Maybe I need to reach out for a friend. But if I bring that executive functioning back online, it will help me decide to do what it is that I need to be okay. And so, being able to name it to tame it. And also, the fish don't feel as big if I can name it. It doesn't feel as scary, because if that's an angry fish over there, for instance, if I just feel the rage and sort of become that rage, then that feels very scary. But if I say out loud, I'm feeling some rage, just the act of doing that puts it into perspective.
It seems like until you reach that point where you can at least acknowledge the thing, that they seem bigger because you're holding a magnifying glass over the thing, which doesn't feel like quite the right analogy, because you'd think that was the same as acknowledging it, but it's almost like remaining in that uncertainty that we talked about, where you haven't named anything yet, and yet still seeing everything through a magnifying glass.
Yeah, yeah. It feels like I think that's a good analogy to an extent. I think it feels like. Do you remember the parts of Fantasia where everything's kind of flying around and it feels very dreamlike and all of that? I know that that's an older.
It's funny. I ran across that title the other day, and I thought, I haven't seen this since I was a kid. I might watch it again.
Yeah, it feels like everything's just kind of flying around and it feels very out of control. And when things are out of control, that can be very scary. If you have no control over anything, then you have no control over anything, and anything is possible. And if you've experienced trauma, anything is possible means that anything could hurt you. And so being able to name it means that you put it in its proper place, and it no longer feels out of control. It is, I am feeling angry, which means I cannot feel angry. I am feeling angry means that eventually that anger will go away and I will still be here, right? And so it is a way of putting it into perspective enough where we feel like we're in control. I'm a huge Dune fan. That's not a secret to people in my life. I have been since I was forever little. Enough that I raised my kids on Dune like a Bible. It was kind of sad. Sort of, kind of. I'm not sorry, though. But there is now that there's the movie's out, people now know what I'm talking about, which has been an interesting transition. But they kind of sort of know because they know from the movie. Long story, read the book. There is a litany against fear there that they use pretty quickly in the book.
Fear is the mind killer.
Fear is the mind killer, the little death, the obliteration. Well, fear is the mind killer, the obliteration that brings. So at the end of it, it says, the fear will pass through me and move on, basically. And in the end, I will stand and I will look back at the fear and I will be here, right? That's the whole concept around that bottom part. And basically that litany is saying, yes, that fear can feel overwhelming, but it's not me. And it will pass in me and through me, but eventually it will go through me. And then when it goes, only I will remain. That is the last line of that litany, only I will remain. And that's really kind of, the pond still stays there, but the fish are gone. It's that same concept.
I like that.
I love that litany against fear. A lot of my clients have a copy of it
Yeah.
and have for many, many years. Thank you, Frank Herbert. So, yeah.
Good job, Frank.
Yes.
I think that's a good stopping point for this one.
I think so.
We're going to be leading from this one straight into another catchy one, which is Feel It to Heal It. So I hope you look forward to that one. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.